In 1347, a ship entered the harbor of Messina, Sicily, and the scene on board was horrifying. Many people had died before anyone truly understood what had happened. Within days, the harbor no longer looked like a doorway to trade. It began to look like the mouth of a grave. The people did not know what they were living through. They only knew that some unknown dark force had reached the shore, a force that prayer could not stop, and distance could not keep away. At first, they were not asking what disease this was. They were asking why even the power of God could not hold it back. To the people of Messina, this was not the beginning of an ordinary disaster. It looked like the first moment death openly walked out of the sea and into Europe. At that time, no one knew that the name Black Death would later become one of the deepest nightmares in European memory. They only saw ships arrive, the sick and the dead brought toward the city, and fear spreading from the harbor like a fog. The city tried to push the danger away, but the plague had already moved faster than any order. Some fled. Some hid inside their homes. Some went to church to pray. Others began to wonder whether this was a judgment sent from heaven. The truly terrifying thing was this: when the Black Death entered Europe, it did not come like a war. It had no army, no banners, no siege engines, and no enemy that anyone could see. It followed ships, roads, and human movement until it entered the city one step at a time. Europe had grown powerful through these connections. Ports made cities wealthy. Trade routes kept goods moving. Pilgrimage roads connected faith across long distances. War and royal power carried news across borders. But the Black Death forced people to understand something darker. The more connected civilization became, the easier it was for death to find a road. Messina was only the first doorway. From there, the plague spread through the Mediterranean world, entered the Italian peninsula, and continued toward France, Spain, England, the German lands, and beyond. By 1348, many European cities were no longer hearing rumors of a distant disaster. They were seeing death in their own streets. Florence, Siena, Venice, Genoa, and other cities, once proud of wealth, trade, art, and religious order, began to suffer the same transformation. The city still stood, but the life inside it had been rearranged around death. People still saw churches. They still heard bells. They still walked through familiar streets. But everything had changed meaning. The bell was no longer only a call to worship or burial. It became a reminder that death was still coming closer. A door was no longer only the entrance to a home. It could become the border of danger. A street was no longer only a place where people passed one another. It became a path for rumor, flight, bodies, and fear. The Black Death turned European cities into living graveyards, not only because there were too many dead, but because the living had begun to exist inside the order of death. The city did not collapse all at once. In fact, it continued to function. People still had to search for food. Children still had to be cared for. Families still had to decide whether to visit the sick. Priests still had to answer the dying. Officials still had to deal with bodies, fear, and public disorder. But every ordinary action had been changed by death. To visit someone who was sick might be mercy, or it might be a walk toward your own grave. To remain with family might be love, or it might be destruction. To flee the city might be survival, or it might be betrayal. Plague turned daily life into a moral trial. It did not ask what people believed in peaceful times. It asked what they would do when death truly entered the room. Many records from that period are disturbing not only because they describe mass death, but because they describe the breaking of ordinary life. Some writers remembered families abandoning one another. Others remembered priests, caretakers, and ordinary people who stayed until they too were taken. Both truths belong to the same disaster. The Black Death did not reveal one simple version of human nature. It forced everything hidden inside a city to the surface: fear, love, duty, selfishness, faith, exhaustion, despair, and the need to ask what death meant. To understand why this event became tied to God, we have to understand how medieval Europeans saw the world. To them, the world was not a cold physical space. It was a sacred order. Churches, bells, relics, confession, mass, burial, and graveyards were not just parts of daily life. They were the main ways people understood life, death, sin, forgiveness, and judgment. Death itself was not only the stopping of the body, it concerned the soul. It concerned whether a person had confessed, whether a priest had arrived, whether the body had been buried properly, and whether the dead had been returned to sacred order. In that world, dying was not just an ending. It was the most dangerous crossing a human being could make before judgment. The Black Death shattered that entire order. Too many people died, and they died too quickly. Priests could not reach every bedside. Funerals could not be completed for every person. Graveyards filled. New pits were opened. Bodies had to be handled faster, more roughly, and with less ceremony. To modern people, this may look like the collapse of medical ability and city management. To medieval people, it felt like the collapse of the spiritual world itself. If a person died without confession, what would happen to the soul? If a family was too afraid to touch the dead, had love failed? If the church could not protect the city, if priests themselves were dying, if prayers grew louder while death continued, then how else could people explain it? This is why the Black Death became more than a disease. It became a symbol of judgment. People did not connect plague with God because they were foolish. They did so because they lived in an age that explained disaster through religion. Famine, war, strange signs in the sky, earthquakes, floods, and sudden mass death could all be understood as divine warning, the result of sin, or a sign of the end times. When the Black Death moved through cities with unstoppable speed, people naturally asked whether God was angry, whether human sin had become too great, whether the end of the world was near, or whether their city had been chosen by fate. This does not mean the plague truly came from divine punishment. It means that, inside the medieval imagination, a catastrophe this large could not be treated as an accident. It was too vast, too fast, too invisible, and too indiscriminate. It killed the poor, and it killed the wealthy. It approached children, and it approached priests. It entered homes, and it entered monasteries. It frightened rulers, and it crushed ordinary people. Death seemed to cross every boundary human beings had built, so people placed it inside the only frame large enough to hold it: God, sin, judgment, and the end of the world. Florence in 1348 shows how deeply this collapse entered the imagination of the city. In the opening of the Decameron, Giovanni Boccaccio left a memory of Florence torn open by plague. In his description, people no longer fully trusted the old duties between relatives, neighbors, servants, and familiar faces. Some fled. Some hid themselves away. Some gave themselves to pleasure, as if tomorrow had already lost its meaning. Others were forced to stay and face deaths that no one wanted to handle. The most important thing here is not the exact number of bodies in the streets. It is that the relationships inside the city began to fail. Home was no longer always a shelter. Kinship did not always defeat fear. Wealth did not always buy certainty. Even the church could not always provide complete comfort. Florence had been a symbol of civilization, wealth, and culture. But the Black Death made it see that urban order was not as solid as people had believed. It depended on trust. It depended on habit. It depended on shared ritual. It depended on the belief that tomorrow would continue to resemble today. The plague broke that belief. Sienna's fate became an even stronger symbol of a future interrupted by death. Before the Black Death, Siena was an ambitious city. It had wealth, religious pride, civic confidence, and building plans that looked toward the future. It had expanded its cathedral, trying to prove the greatness of the city through stone and faith. But after the plague entered in 1348, the first thing Siena lost was not its buildings. It lost its ability to keep moving forward. People died too fast, families were emptied, work stopped, confidence broke. The Sienese chronicler Agnolo di Tura left a heavy memory of the disaster, including the pain of burying his own children. That detail matters because it turns the Black Death from a line on a map into a father standing before a grave. Siena's unfinished cathedral project therefore became a powerful historical symbol. It was not only an unfinished building, it looked like the moment a city had been forced to stop. Siena had tried to build upward, toward permanence and the sacred. After the plague, it had to measure the future by graves. This contrast is one reason the Black Death became almost mythic in European memory. It was a real historical event, but people remembered it as a shadow of fate. The harbor became the doorway through which death entered Europe. The bell became the echo of judgment. The graveyard became the city's second face. The unfinished church became a future cut short. God did not truly write a sentence across the sky, but for the people living through it, everything felt like judgment. And once people understood disaster as judgment, they began to search for guilt. If this was punishment, who had sinned? If this was God's anger, who had brought that anger down? Sometimes this search turned into confession. Sometimes it turned into self-punishment. During the Black Death, groups of flagellants appeared in parts of Europe, publicly whipping their own bodies as acts of repentance, trying to answer invisible divine anger with visible suffering. Their actions may seem extreme today, but within their world, the logic was clear. If plague was punishment, then pain might win forgiveness. If the world had been stained by sin, then public repentance might turn God back toward mercy. This belief made the Black Death even darker. The disaster did not only fill graveyards, it filled people with the fear that every death had meaning, and that every city might be standing beneath an unseen sentence. After the first waves of the Black Death passed, Europe did not simply return to what it had been. Cities reopened, markets slowly filled again, churches held services again, roads once more carried travelers, but many things had changed. Too many people had vanished. Too many families had broken. Too many rituals had failed. Too many people had seen the moment when prayer could not stop death. Labor shortages, changes in inheritance, social conflict, religious anxiety, and darker images of death in art all continued the consequences of the disaster in different places. Death did not remain in the graveyard. It entered law, land, wages, family memory, and religious imagination. The later image of the dance of death continued this memory. Death was shown as a dancer, a guide, a skeletal companion, pulling kings, bishops, merchants, peasants, children, and beggars into the same procession. That image was powerful because it answered the deepest fear created by the Black Death. In life, rank could decide almost everything. In death, every rank was dragged toward the same earth. Of course, no real figure of death danced through the streets, but the Black Death made death feel like a visible presence. It seemed able to walk, choose, knock, and pull an entire city into its rhythm. The later plague doctor, with the bird-like mask and black robe, also belongs to this world of memory. Strictly speaking, the famous beaked mask belongs more to later plague centuries than to the first wave of the Black Death itself. But people connect it with the Black Death because it gives a face to invisible fear. The black robe looks like a shadow. The mask hides human expression. The cane creates distance. The figure looks less like an ordinary doctor and more like a witness sent into the city by an age of death. What the Black Death truly left behind was not only a death count, it left an entire dark imagination about cities, faith, and mortality. It taught Europeans that a city could have walls and still fail to keep fear outside. It could have churches and still feel that God was silent. It could have laws and still be unable to command death to stop. It could have wealth and still lose order. It could still stand and yet become a graveyard in spirit. This is the real meaning of a living graveyard. It does not mean everyone was already dead. It means the living had been forced to live under the rules of death. They waited for the next bell. They waited for the next rumor. They waited to know whether the priest could still come. They waited to know whether their neighbor was still alive. They waited to know whether God would answer. The Black Death took place in the middle of the 14th century. It entered Europe through sea trade and overland routes, spread through connected cities, and struck the religious order through which medieval people understood life and death. It became tied to God not because it proved divine punishment, but because the people of that world had no other frame large enough for such a catastrophe. They explained it through God, sin, judgment, and the end of time, and it turned cities into living graveyards, not only because the graveyards could not hold the dead, but because death became the center of urban life, rearranging action, faith, fear, and memory. In the end, the Black Death became one of the deepest shadows in European history. It showed that when disaster cannot be explained, human beings turn it into myth. When a city cannot stop death, People begin to hear judgment in every bell. And when the dead become too many for memory to carry, history turns them into symbols. Subscribe to this channel, because history's darkest shadows are rarely gone. Most of them are only waiting to be read again.